I just want to start off with thanking Jenny and the AIGA for putting on this event. I think it's really important to have events like this. It's a really good moment for design. And I think we should do a round of applause for all the speakers that have already been up here. I know it's a little corny, but let's do it. And I didn't know that I was going to have an introduction, so I made my own. So, hi, I'm Matt. And I'm a web designer. And looks like I don't have my notes up here. So, I work at a small startup called Facebook in California. Previously, I ran a company called Things That Are Brown in Seattle with my wife. And we worked on a number of great projects. We work with brands like Microsoft, the Professional Bowlers Association, Harvest, and Mix Online, which is a division of Microsoft. And it's good because when I made the jump to Facebook, I worked on the communication design team. And this is a very similar work to what I've been doing at in my previous company. But enough about me. I want to talk about a problem that I see in web design. I see that design and content are on equal footing. Design right now is sexy. It's having its moment. There's never been a point in time when we've had more people thinking and talking about design than right now, and it's only getting more relevant. To piggyback on Jay's talk, that pink dot, even though it's still a pink dot, more people are realizing there is a pink dot, and that this is growing in influence. Content, not so much. It's still seen as just words on a page. It's something that people can just fill in at the last minute. And I think this is a problem. So this is my talk. Stop filling buckets. Better design through content. So what's a bucket? Well, a bucket is just my stupid metaphor for a web page. And a web page is a blank canvas. It's something that, as a designer, we instinctively want to fill. And we want to fill it like a bucket. And when we fill buckets, we heave things in. And this is what happens to web pages. How they get heavy, how they get long. We fill them up with video, we fill them up with words, we fill them up with images, we fill them up with social media plugins. They're things we want to see realized. But we often don't consider the strategy behind it first. And it gets much worse. I'm sure everyone's seen something like this. This is just a sitemap. It's a sitemap of a very typical page, or very typical site. Home, about us, services, case studies. Probably 90% of the sites on the internet are like this or much worse. But it gets even worse. Because after we make a sitemap, we make a wireframe, which is essentially just buckets within buckets. And it gets all Inception, and we don't know our way out. Because it becomes buckets all the way down. And pretty soon, we're simply packing pages full of copy. We're simply packing pages full of information. And we don't even know really what we're doing. So how do we fix for this? So I have 5 quick ways to help address this. The number one most important thing is to start with copy. Typically, most designers start by opening up Photoshop. Maybe they have a quick brainstorm, but typically we don't start with writing. And I think this is where most people make the mistake. And we all know that content is king. We've heard this. Jeffrey Zeldman made a career out of talking about the idea that content is king. And I'm sure no one here, I would hope no one here would disagree with that. I mean, there's some topics that are maybe a little sensitive, but I don't think this is a sensitive topic. Content is what is on the site. It's what makes the site important. But to get there, to get to address content, we have to address strategy. So what is strategy? Well, strategy is the what of the problem you're trying to solve. It's why your project is relevant or important. This is Dave Egger's book, What is the What? And in this book, or the title of this book comes from an African creation myth. And it's this idea that you can be a happy rancher and be content to till the soil without really questioning the why of what you're doing. Or you can be essentially a nomad who's walking the earth, constantly questioning their role in life. And what I suggest is that we do more of the latter. We need to question what we're building from the beginning. So how do we get to strategy? Well, we get to strategy by a thorough discussion. And we get to strategy by doing a lot of conversations and asking the right questions. So an example of a great question, and my wife is amazing at this, is the idea of framing. So typically when we work with clients, this is internal at Facebook and also on our own agency, is to ask someone what their product is all about. And when you ask someone that question, immediately they give you back a very typical elevator pitch. It's usually the first sentence on their website. They recite it back to you. But then after, as a follow-up, you ask a simple reframing question, which is, say that same thing to me, pretend I'm your 5-year-old niece. And immediately, like a lever flips in their head, and they drop away that feeling of trying to please, this idea of the audience, and they know who they're talking to. They know that they're talking to someone who doesn't understand the technology, who doesn't have a frame of reference, and who needs to understand this stuff as simply as possible. So it boils down all the bullshit that most people typically lean into without even noticing. So at Facebook, we have a room, and it's called the Dream Room. And it's not like a John Cale performance space. It's really just a really boring office room with a bunch of cheap furniture. But it has 4 walls, and these 4 walls are covered in whiteboard. You can write on every wall. And you can write on the tables, too. And we don't allow laptops in there. And there's kind of a debate on whether an iPad is considered a laptop or not, but we kind of try and kip those things out. 3 people bought them in 1 week, so they were all there. So the importance of this room is to get people talking about the problems and to get people starting to frame problems to solve. So this is where we ask all the questions. And these, just I want to run through these really quickly. This is not something that's unique to Facebook. This is, I think, standard rules for brainstorming. Defer judgment, encourage wild ideas, build on the ideas of others, stay focused and on topic, and have one conversation at a time. Be visual and go for quantity. But there's an also important part of writing that plays into uncovering the strategy. Discussion is important for opening it up, but writing can actually help you narrow that down. This is a great quote. I want to focus on the first part, but the second part was too funny to leave out. So I write to discover what I think. After all, the bars aren't open that early. This is a historian who is explaining why he wrote from home at 6:30 in the morning to 8:30 a.m. But the idea of writing to discover what I think is really important. So in the early brainstorming phase, you want to engage on a copywriter to start brainstorming ideas to help be generative. And this is the most important part of starting with writing. You want to start generating ideas. And you want to be as open and expressive as possible. Nothing is a bad idea. You want to write as much as you can. You want to talk about your strategy. You want to talk about your company's history. You want to talk about your audience. You want to talk about everything that relates to your product, your company, or your organization. And that's super important because at some point, you're going to have to edit this down. So this right here is a set of explorations we did when we were redesigning our own site, which hasn't launched just yet. So this is an exploration, and this consumed our entire house. If this looks bad, that our entire house was covered with paper. But what we did was we did SWOT analysis. I'd never thought in a million years I would do a SWOT analysis, but it was helpful because it helped generate a lot of different ideas that I normally wouldn't have. And we did bios, and we did explorations of all of our competitors. So again, be generative, because the most important part of writing is editing. And you want to cut that copy down. If you say something in 5 pages, you need to learn how to say it in 2. So right here, this is some hipster Ipsum. Here's 3 pages. You want to cut it down to 1. Both of them don't make sense, but this one is at least easier to stomach. I was going to actually write a real example, but I thought this would be more fun. Next level food truck cred. I don't know. But the point is to edit that copy. You want to pare things down to their bare essentials. And it forces you to focus on the true message. And this is one of my favorite quotes on writing and editing. If it sounds like writing, I rewrite it. And I think tone is important. Tone isn't something you can just inject later. Tone is something that informs the writing process. So this is always important when you're writing, to read what you write aloud. If you can't read it out loud without it sounding awful, you need to try harder. So here's a quick checklist for content work from Aaron Kassane. And I'm just going to run through these points. I think these are a really good rubric for writing good copy. But I don't want to dwell on them too much. So appropriate. Content should be appropriate for the business and its users. It should be useful, and it should help people get something done. It should be user-centered, and it should match the user's mental model, what they expect to see. It needs to be clear and make sense, and so that the meaning will come through. And it needs to be consistent so that people know what to expect. And of course, it needs to be concise. No mission statements, press releases, or fluff. So at Facebook, we have a content strategy team of 5 people right now. And we work very iteratively with the design and product design teams. And this is a logo I made for the content strategy team, or a t-shirt I made for them. The idea of the Fox, Friends of Content Strategy. It's a play on words that went over well at a conference. So this right here is an example of a project that launched about 3 months ago. This is video calling. And this is copy that I got before I started Photoshop. This had been going on. I had been involved in some of the earlier brainstorms, but this was Ebony Thomas. She wrote this copy, and this was all created, again, before I had touched Photoshop. No layouts, no nothing. And then this is what came out of it. And again, if you look back and forth, the translation between these two is interesting, because the design was easy, because the copy addressed the real issues. This page could be light, it could be straightforward, and it could just play on the strengths of the product. So just to point out things, bring your conversations to life. Sometimes an emoticon is not just enough. We're explaining the value propositions of the product without having to overemphasize them. So here we have a process that's very linear. This idea of strategy, moving into copy, moving into design, and moving into a shipped website. And this is a good linear process, but it doesn't address what I think is the most important part of the design and copy issue. And that is that this part right here, design and copy, has to be iterative. We can't simply have a straightforward push. We need to make this a constant feedback loop. So at Facebook, I work directly with the content strategists, and we work on the same machine. So once the copy's been written and once I take a stab at the design, we sit down together and we work through the copy together, because editing this copy makes it stronger and it respects the medium. Because copy does not exist in this Word document, it exists on this web page. And then after that, you can ship the website. So I want to talk a little bit about framing. So framing is important because it helps us limit how much we can write. So this is something that dawned on me, and Luke Wroblewski talks about this quite a bit. He has a bunch of posts about this idea of mobile first. And most people think about mobile first in the context of a product or an app. And this idea that you want to limit your app's, or you want to focus on the core part of your app's functionality. But I think mobile before you design the desktop is important, because you get to focus on limiting your message and limiting your copy. So here's a quote that I think is apt. This is from Steve Krug, and I think he's one of the best writers on this topic. And he's speaking about the desktop here, but it actually, I think, plays well into the mobile sphere. We're usually in a hurry. Much of our web use is motivated by the desire to save time, and we just don't have time to read any more than necessary. Now, if you think about this, we're sitting down in front of a computer, and we're staring into a screen. Now, if you think about that in the context of a mobile experience, you're walking, you're almost getting hit by a car, there's a bird, shitting on your head, there's many things that are going to distract you. If your copy doesn't work on the desktop, it won't work on a phone. And the other issue is an issue of fidelity. On a screen, you have about an eighth of the average browser window. So you literally can't put as much content there. And this becomes really important because mobile is the ultimate squint test. And this is an old concept, but it's really shocking to me that people don't talk about this more often, because most people don't care. When you read websites, you really are just scanning. You're not looking at everything and readings top to bottom. I mean, it's just unbearable how little people are going to pay attention to your work, something that you've spent months on. People are going to literally read one line and then close their browser. So the squint test is this idea of pulling back, looking at your site from the highest level possible, literally squinting, and taking just a step back and thinking, like, if someone takes just the top part of the site, the biggest element on the page, what are they going to understand? So that's why we design a screenful at a time. So this is when you pull up into the desktop, you want to scale the experience, but you don't want to scale, but you don't want to increase the content. So it's about scaling the experience, scaling the amount, the experience of the design, but not scaling the copy or the content. So here's an excellent website. This is Square's website. They're a payment processor. But again, this plays into that idea of designing a screenful. This is their entire splash page. They do have a couple screens behind here, but this is pretty much the main entryway here. And what's amazing to me about this is if you do a squint test on this, it's amazing because you get to see just the phone and just the copy up top. And just having those elements, it's immediately clear what this is. It's a card reader for your phone. Start accepting credit cards today. There's no confusion. There's nothing there getting in the way of understanding. And these 4 points right here aren't essential. If you are a business who's interested in a payment processor, you can pare down through these. You can scan down through these messages and see if it's right for you. So one of the other amazing things at Facebook has been the opportunity to test with users. And most people, when they talk about user testing, they think about it in the context of a UI. They think about it in the context of testing a functional application, an application like Facebook. But what I think is really interesting is using user testing to test people and how they read and perceive copy, and how they read and perceive your messaging. This has been incredibly helpful. One of the things that you'll notice when you watch a person read your copy is they'll scan. And typically, a user who comes in for a session like this is paid a small sum. So these are people who are paid to do what you tell them, to read through your copy, to be able to tell it back to them. And they're taking their time and they're focusing on it. And they will invariably misread, missee, and just completely just gloss over everything that you've spent your time on. And one of the most interesting things to find out is that people won't actually respond to what you want them to understand, but it's what they want to understand. So when they're reading through this thing, if they think a feature is going to give them the ability to have, like 10 inboxes, that's what they want. So that's what they perceive. But it's not what they're getting. So when that happens, you have to stop. You have to rewrite your copy because it needs to be honest and clear. And if someone has a gap in understanding, it's going to be terrible for the product. So this has been incredibly helpful. I suggest that everybody just dive in and get people in front of it. It doesn't have to be formal. It can be incredibly informal. So just to recap, start with copy, edit that copy, mobile before www, design a screenful, and test with users. And this helps set up a much better process than a simple linear strategy, copywriting, design, and shipping a product. But I have a bonus slide. And I really didn't think that I would be at a conference where I think every single presenter either referenced Steve Jobs or had him in his slide. And I'm actually using the slide of the book that I believe it was Jay that wrote, The Design is How It Works. So I think this is an incredibly poignant quote. This is one of my favorite quotes in design because it gets to the core of two things relating to my talk. One is the idea of, and I'm just pointing to the bottom part, design is how it works. So with copy, design is only successful if the copy is successful. So copy is what makes a design work. If the message isn't there, if the message isn't clear, no amount of design is going to make that be functional. If it doesn't communicate, it literally will not work. But the other element about this is this idea that design is how it works. And we all know that Steve also had another quote about real artists ship. And I think that is actually packed into here as well. Because design is actually how it works. It's not about the process. So I've given an overview of process between copy and design, but I don't want that to be the takeaway. I want the takeaway to be the idea that design is how it works, and you judge the success of your work based on the takeaway of your product. So your end product is what you judge. If people don't understand it, you haven't done your job. So I think one thing that is really helpful to focus on in conferences like these is we talk about process. We talk about getting a better way of doing our work, and that's important. But what we're judged on is what we actually release and not how we do it. So work on your process, but make sure it results in great work. Thank you guys so much.